I can still hear my mother-in-law's voice the way she said it. Calm, almost bored, like she was reading off a grocery list. She told my son that he was not her blood, that he never would be, and that he needed to go wait in the car. He was 6 years old. It was 11 degrees outside, and the car was locked. I didn't find out until 3 hours later when a neighbor 2 houses down called 911 after finding my son curled up behind their recycling bin trying to stay out of the wind. I was at work when my phone rang. The number was an Evanston area code I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, a woman introduced herself as a paramedic. She said my son's name. She said the word hypothermia. And everything after that, the drive to the hospital, the blur of fluorescent lights, the feeling of my own hands against the steering wheel. None of it felt real until I walked into that room and saw him under 3 blankets with warming pads taped to his chest and an IV in his small arm. He looked up at me and said, "Mommy, I waited for you. I have never in my life felt anything the way I felt in that moment. Not when I passed my CPA exam. Not when I got promoted to senior auditor at 31. Not even when I held him for the first time 6 years before that. What I felt standing at the foot of that hospital bed was something that doesn't have a name. It was grief and fury and love so massive it had nowhere to go. I sat down next to him, and I held his hand, and I did not cry. I made a decision instead. But I need to back up. Because what happened that night didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of something that had been building for 4 years. Since the day I married into a family that had already decided who I was before I ever walked through their door. My husband and I met in graduate school. He was getting his MBA. I was finishing my master's in accounting. We were in the same study group for 1 semester, and I think I fell in love with him somewhere between his third bad joke about tax code and the way he always made sure there was coffee when he knew it was going to be a late night. We got married 2 years later, on a Saturday in September, at a venue outside Chicago. It was small, it was ours. I thought it was the beginning. What I didn't fully understand then was that my husband came with conditions I hadn't been told about. His family had money. Not new money either. The kind that had been in the same accounts for 2 generations, the kind that came with a house in Evanston, with a gate and a guest book that tracked who came for Sunday dinners and who didn't. His mother ran that household like a corporation. His father had been the CFO of a manufacturing company before he retired, and he still spoke to people like he was reviewing their quarterly reports. His older brother had married a woman from their same social circle, a woman whose family had a summer house in Michigan, and who knew how to talk about wine in a way that made it sound like a professional qualification. And then there was me. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Southside Chicago. My mother cleaned office buildings at night and worked a lunch counter during the day. My father left when I was 4. I put myself through school on scholarships and federal loans, and one summer where I worked 3 jobs simultaneously. By the time I met my husband, I had paid off every dollar I owed. I had a savings account, a 401k, and a credit score that was higher than most people's blood pressure. I had done every single thing right. None of that mattered to his mother. From the beginning, she found ways to let me know where I stood. It was never loud. That's the thing about women like her. They don't raise their voices, they raise an eyebrow. They ask questions that are really statements. She would compliment my dress in a way that made it sound like she was surprised I owned one. She would ask about my work and then change the subject before I finished answering. She introduced me to people at parties as my son's wife and let the pause before my name do all the work. My father-in-law was quieter about it. He mostly just didn't look at me. My brother-in-law and his wife were polite in the way that people are polite when they've been told to be. His wife once asked me, at Thanksgiving, whether my mother was still working. There was something in the way she said still that I chose not to respond to. I filed it away. My husband saw it. He did. But he had grown up in that house, which meant he had also grown up minimizing what happened in that house. He would say things like, "That's just how she is," or "She doesn't mean it that way." And I loved him, so I let it go more than I should have. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself things would get better. They didn't. When our son was born, I genuinely believed that a baby would change something, that it would be impossible to hold a child and still see his mother as an outsider. My mother-in-law held him for about 45 seconds at the hospital before handing him back and asking my husband if he'd thought about a nanny. She never asked me. She talked about him as though he were an extension of her son and not also an extension of me. She called him her first real grandchild. Her other daughter-in-law had been unable to have children. I heard her say it once at a dinner and I sat very still and made sure my face didn't move. When my son was old enough to go to Sunday dinners at the house in Evanston, she was good with him. I'll give her that. She taught him card games and let him help in the garden and always had his favorite cereal in the cabinet. He loved going there. He talked about Grandma's house with the kind of excitement that only a small child can produce about a place that means safety and cookies and being the center of someone's world. I never told him what I saw. He was a child. Those were his people, even if they weren't fully mine. I protected him from all of it, which is why what she did is so unforgivable to me. Not just as a wrong, as a betrayal. Because she knew how much he trusted her. She knew he would do whatever she said, and she used that. It was a Sunday in January, 2 months before everything fell apart for good. My husband had asked me to come to dinner, but I had a year-end audit due the following morning, and I told him I'd meet them thereafter. He took our son early. I was supposed to arrive by 6. At 5:40, I got a call from my husband. His mother had said something at the table, something about a vase that had gone missing from the sitting room. She said it had been there before my son arrived. She looked at my son when she said it. My husband told me quietly on the phone that she was saying our son had taken it. He was 6. He had never in his life taken anything that wasn't his. I had raised him to say please and thank you, and ask before he touched anything in someone else's home. I knew this because I had lived that same kind of childhood where you learn very early that the rules for you are different from the rules for everyone else, and I had worked hard to give him confidence without the fear I grew up with. My husband said he would handle it. I said I was on my way. By the time I arrived, my son was not in the house. My husband met me at the door. His face looked like a man who had just realized something terrible about himself. He said that while he had stepped away to call me, his mother had told our son to go wait in the car. He said he thought she meant for just a moment. He said he didn't know she had the keys. I walked past him. I walked into the dining room where his mother was sitting at the head of the table with a glass of red wine and an expression of absolute composure. My brother-in-law and his wife were there too. Nobody looked like someone who had just sent a 6-year-old outside in January. I said, "Where is my son?" She looked up at me. She said he needed to think about what he did. The car is locked. It's 11 degrees. "Where is my son?" she said. "Children need consequences." I turned around and walked out. I did not have the keys. They were on the hook by the kitchen door. I grabbed them on my way through. I went out to the driveway. The car was empty. I searched every inch of that driveway. I went around the side of the house. I called his name until I couldn't hear myself anymore. I knocked on the neighbor's door. I knocked on the next one. I was 2 doors down when the porch light came on and an elderly man opened the door and said, "Are you looking for the little boy?" The ambulance just came. He had been found on the other side of the neighbor's recycling bins. He'd been outside for somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour in temperatures that the paramedic said were dangerous for an adult, let alone a child his size. At the hospital, while my son was being stabilized, I called the police. Not my husband, not my mother-in-law, the police. I gave them the address of the house in Evanston. I gave them her name. I told them exactly what she had said when I asked where he was. They went to the house that night. She was not arrested. The detective who followed up with me the next morning explained that because my son had not suffered what the law classified as serious bodily injury, and because she would claim she believed the car was unlocked, criminal charges would be difficult. I listened to all of this. I wrote down everything he said. I thanked him and hung up. Then, I called my attorney. I want to explain something about my work, because it becomes relevant. As a forensic accountant, which is what I had become after 10 years in public accounting and a pivot I made because I am very good at finding things that people try to hide, I spend my professional life looking at financial records that don't add up. I look for inconsistencies. I look for money that moved in ways it shouldn't have. I am licensed, I have federal clearances for certain types of work, and I have spent my career building relationships with people at agencies that I am not going to name specifically. I had always kept my professional life completely separate from my husband's family. I had never used what I knew about their finances, which I knew because I had been present at family discussions and had helped my husband with his own tax filing, for anything other than keeping my own accounts in order. After that night, I started paying closer attention. It took me about 6 weeks to find the first problem. My father-in-law had a family trust that had been established in the 90s. I knew about it because my husband had mentioned it in the context of estate planning. What I found when I started pulling the publicly available records and cross-referencing them with some documents my husband had in his home office that he'd asked me to help organize 2 years earlier was that the distributions from that trust did not match the filings. The discrepancy was not small. It was the kind of number that gets people federal attention. I also found that my brother-in-law, who managed one of his father's rental properties, had been claiming maintenance expenses that did not correspond to any work that had been permitted or inspected by the county. The amounts were consistent. The pattern was clear. I am very good at my job. I did not do anything with this information right away. I prepared documentation. I organized everything in a format that would be immediately legible to the people who would eventually review it. I made copies. I kept them in a safe deposit box at a bank branch my husband had never been to. I did not tell him what I was doing. In the meantime, I made decisions about my son's life that I should have made a long time ago. He did not go back to Evanston. When my husband pushed back on this, I told him that our son had been sent outside in freezing temperatures by his mother and had been found by a stranger behind a trash can, and that if he wanted to discuss appropriate boundaries, I was available on weekday evenings after 8. He did not push back again. My mother-in-law called me once, about 2 weeks after the hospital. She said she wanted to explain herself. She said our son had been disrespectful and that she had made a parenting decision. I listened to every word. I did not interrupt her. When she was finished, I said, "I appreciate you calling," and I hung up. She called again the next day. I didn't answer. The vase, by the way, was found in the attic 2 weeks after the incident. One of the housekeepers mentioned it to my husband. Nobody in that family said a word to me about it. The confrontation I had planned happened on a Sunday in March. My father-in-law had been hospitalized briefly for a cardiac event. Minor, he recovered, and the family had gathered at the house in Evanston for what his mother was calling a family meeting about his health and what it would mean for the trust. I came. I had not been expected to come, I think, but I was still technically family, and I walked in with my husband and sat down at that dining room table that I had eaten at 100 times, while being made to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My mother-in-law was at the head of the table. My father-in-law was at the other end, looking tired. My brother-in-law and his wife were on the left side. My husband was next to me. My mother-in-law started talking about the trust. She talked about distributions. She talked about what would happen if my father-in-law needed long-term care. She used the word family 7 times in the first 4 minutes. She did not look at me once. When she paused, I opened the folder I had brought with me and set a copy of my documentation in front of each person at the table. I said, "Before we continue, I'd like to walk through some discrepancies I found in the trust filings." The room went very quiet. I have given presentations to federal examiners. I have testified as an expert witness. I have sat across from attorneys whose job it was to make me nervous and found that I was not nervous. What I felt at that table, in that room, in that house where I had been quietly dismissed for 4 years, was something close to peace. I walked through each item, the trust distributions, the maintenance expense irregularities, the 2 years of returns where the depreciation schedule on the rental property did not match the assessed value. I was calm. I used precise language. I did not raise my voice. My brother-in-law stood up at some point. He said I had no right, that this was a private family matter, that I was making accusations. I said, "These are records. I'm not making accusations. I'm reading numbers." My father-in-law looked at the papers. He looked at his son. He looked at his wife. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen there before. My mother-in-law said, "You need to leave." I said, "I've already filed copies with the IRS and the State Revenue Department. I filed last Thursday. I wanted you to hear it from me first." I closed my folder. I stood up. I looked at my mother-in-law, really looked at her for a long moment, and I said, "My son waited for me. I hope you remember that." I walked out of that house. I drove home. I picked my son up from my neighbor's, where he had been watching a movie and eating popcorn, and I held him for a long time while he told me everything that happened in the movie, and I said, and really?" At what I hoped were the right moments because I was not fully present. Part of me was still at that table. The audit that followed was not quick. These things never are. But they are thorough. My brother-in-law retained an attorney almost immediately, which was noted. My father-in-law cooperated, which was also noted. The rental property issue was ultimately referred to the county DA in addition to the IRS referral, and my brother-in-law faced charges that included tax fraud and falsification of records. My mother-in-law was not charged with anything related to the financial irregularities because her name was not on the accounts in question. What she did face was a civil matter, a report I had filed separately with DCFS documenting the incident with my son, which triggered an investigation. Nothing criminal came of it, but the record exists. Her name is attached to it. In a community like hers, where reputation functions like currency that has its own kind of weight, my husband and I are no longer married. That is the part of this story that people probably want me to grieve more than I do. But the truth is that what the incident with my son did was not destroy my marriage. It revealed what my marriage had already become. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 40 years learning to look away from the people he loved most when they made him uncomfortable. And I was not willing to raise my son in a Saxasser house. We share custody. My son sees his father regularly. He does not go to Evanston. My father-in-law sent me a letter about 4 months after the audit began. It was handwritten, 3 pages. He said a number of things that I could tell cost him something to put on paper. At the end he said he was sorry for not seeing me clearly. I read it twice, I folded it and put it in a drawer. I have not responded, I don't know yet if I will, that's not something I've decided. What I know is this, my son is 7 now. He started 2nd grade in the fall. He has a best friend named after a type of tree, which he thinks is the funniest thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. He takes swim lessons on Saturday mornings and he has declared that he will be an engineer when he grows up, specifically the kind that designs roller coasters. He sleeps with 2 blankets and a stuffed elephant named Gerald. He doesn't talk about that January night. I don't know how much he remembers. Children process things in ways that aren't always visible. We see a therapist, both of us separately and sometimes together. She is excellent. My son has told her that he knows his mom would always come find him. She told me this at our last session, and I had to take a moment before I could respond. I would always come find him. That part is true. That will always be true. What happened to my family? My husband's family, the house in Evanston, the trust, all of it. I didn't set out to burn it down. I set out to protect my son and I used the only tools I had, which happened to be very good ones. If the people in that house had not built something worth burning, there would have been nothing to find. The vase, by the way, turned out to be worth about $40. One of the housekeepers mentioned that too. My mother-in-law had bought it at a HomeGoods in 2019. My son never took it, but I think most people who listened to that story from the beginning already knew that.